chair of the session. Thank you to all of you for joining. And thank you for addressing your papers on this important topic. I think talking about the risks and opportunities of the electricity market in this moment is particularly important. I mean, we have seen a drop in the electricity demand this year, which had never happened before after the Second World War. And managing this kind of situation is quite difficult. So the more we know about the operation of the market, the more we can manage these problems that we face now and probably we will face in the future. So I think today we have some important contributions related to the management of the electricity market. I would go directly into the presentations. You can see each other who are the participants to this session. We start with Markus Schindler from Austria, which will present a paper on the optimization approach for a local electricity market. Markus, I would give the floor to you, and I don't know how long can be the presentation. We have a bit more than an hour and a half. Is it correct? And we have 4 presentations. So probably 20 minutes each. Yes, 20 minutes, please. If we stay in 20 minutes, then we have some minutes for a bit of discussion. Markus, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, a short question, are my slides visible?
Yes, perfect. We can see it.
Thank you. I would like to welcome to my presentation. The presentation is entitled The Optimization Approach for a Local Energy Market. My name is Markus Schindler and I'm a junior research engineer at the Forschung Burgenland. My main tasks here are the optimization and simulation of energy systems. The Forschung Burgenland is the subsidiary company for research of the University of Applied Sciences Burgenland. So, introduction. This work is here presented was created during the International Beyond project. This project focuses on the integration of renewable energy sources into local and regional energy markets, with a special focus on digitalization and blockchain technologies. Below right, you can see our test area in the village Großschönau. So the current local energy market, there's an energy supplier, there are some consumers who only buys energy from the energy provider, and there are some prosumers which buys energy from the energy provider and sell energy to the energy provider. So here everyone buys energy from the energy provider, and the prosumers also sell energy to the energy supplier. So the energy provider sells energy at the price P grid. The energy provider buys electric energy at the price P feed. In theory, the price P feed must be lower than P grid, so there are no arbitrage conditions. In practice, P grid is significantly higher than the price P feed. So for our local energy provider, these are approximately 6 cents. So that prosumers has to optimize their own demand with respect to the PV production. In a new local energy market, there's also an energy provider and some consumers which buys energy, and some prosumers which also produces energy. These prosumers sell the energy to the energy provider. Everyone buys energy from the energy provider. And the new thing in this market is now that the prosumers also can sell energy to everyone other in this market. So the new local energy market, the energy provider also sells energy at the price P grid. The energy provider buys electric energy at the price P feed, and a prosumer can sell excess energy to all other market participants. So in order to study the effects of such a market, it is necessary to build a mathematical model. For this purpose, some assumptions made at first. So let P be the set of households which sell energy to the grid at a certain time. Let C be the set of households which buy energy from the grid at a certain time. And let P be the set over all time steps for a simulation. So the market formulation, this is a price Pij at which a consumer I, Ci can buy energy from the prosumer Pj. For this price, the following inequation must hold that Pij is greater or equal to P feed, and Pij is lower or equal to P grid. So with this inequation, there's an incentive for a prosumer and a consumer to participate at the local energy trading. In order to study the market effects, the model is now formulated as a linear program. This was chosen because there is only one global minimum. So the costs for the consumer are minimized in our optimization problem, where the function is the cost function for energy consumption of the complete grid, where I is the index over the consumers and J is the index over all prosumers, and K is the index over time. Fijk is here, describes here the prices. The L tensor describes the local energy flows. P grid is the price at which energy is available from the energy provider, and L grid describes the energy which flows from the energy provider to the local market participants. Here are the definitions for the tensors which are used, where M is the number of consumers and N is the number of prosumers, and T is the number of time steps in the simulation. So because this is a linear program, some constraints are necessary, and for the constraints for the consumer are described the following equation, where Dik is the demand of the EV consumer at the kth time step, and L grid Jk is the energy which is delivered to the this must be an I to the IF consumer at the kth time step, and here is the sum of all local energy flows from all prosumers to the consumer. The energy production from the prosumers must satisfy a similar equation where Pjk is the production of the jth prosumer at the kth time step, and here is the sum of the local energy flows in the grid plus P grid Jk, which is the flow from the production to the energy provider, which is sold at the price P feed. So the summary of this model is that there is the objective function which has to be minimized, which describes the overall energy consumption costs from the grid, and there is for every consumer a constraint which describes the demand on energy and where the energy is coming from, and there's also a prosumer constraint which describes the local energy flows whereas the energy which is sold to the global grid. So based on this physics, there's also need a price model for this market. This is based on a physical principle that the energy should sold to the nearest customer. So the price must increase with the increasing distance to the prosumer. In this case, there are different distance matrix available for this, like a spatial distance or the distance in the grid. The price over the distance is in this case modeled using the sigmoid function. The natural boundaries for the price are defined by the spread, which is the difference between P grid and P feed and the P feed price. The offset on the distance axis is so chosen that the median distance of the prosumer to the prosumer pays a price at P feed plus P spread divided by 2. So now the price distribution is not well defined, so we have to add another constraint. So the change in price is defined by that the first quintile pays the price P feed plus P spread divided by 4. So these are the final equations for the price model, where delta Ij defines the Kronecker delta, which is in this case the identity matrix, so that a prosumer has a price of 0 for his own energy demand. And here we can see the offset on the distance axis, which is the median distance to the prosumer, and here the alpha is the parameter which describes the slope, the derivative of the price function, and this is chosen so that with the first quintile of the price. And xj is here the set which all distances from all consumers to the prosumer j. This market is tested using a mixed integer linear program based on the grid structure for the real village of Großschönau in Austria. Here we have 5 prosumers with photovoltaic installed and 21 consumers. Because of there was no measured demand profiles, we generated our demand profiles using the software load profile generator, which is an open source tool developed in Germany for generating good load profiles. You can this can define really smart profiles where for every household specific properties can be assigned. So the results show that the self-consumption has the highest priority. Then the energy is sold to the local market, and the residual energy is sold to the energy provider. So here we can see some charts out of the simulation, where the blue dotted line is the demand of the prosumer P3, and the yellow line is the procured energy. And here this arc is the PV production. There we can see the self-consumption, where at energy spikes, the whole energy which is produced by the PV is consumed by the own consumer, as it's consumed by its own. And here we can see that the whole day, the most energy is provided by the own photovoltaic system. And then when the photovoltaic is not working, there's no sun shining, then energy is used from other sources. And here we have a second chart where we can see that the energy which is sold from the local grid to the self-consumption, the PV production. And you can see when the whole energy is self-consumed, that no energy is sold to the local market. And here we have a chart which describes the cost for every consumer and prosumer. Here you can see that the decrease in costs for prosumers is really high because the price is so much better than in the old system. But the incentives for the consumers are not so high, depending on the amount of PV production in the neighborhood. And the conclusion for this is that this model increases the incentives for consumers to become prosumers, and also the integrated mechanisms decreases the incentives by increasing local PV production. So thank you for attention, and I'm then ready for some questions.
Thank you very much, Markus, for your presentation. I think you are dealing with one of the major topics of the present evolution of the electricity market, because integrating renewables is really the challenge that we are facing right now. I don't know if there is any question. I would try to make questions directly at the end of each presentation so that we are ready to interact. So if any of the persons has a question, please feel free to put your question to Markus. As a matter of fact, I have a question myself, if I can. How do you take into account the congestion of the network? It's not clear to me how the model is dealing with the real network conditions on the local market. So how did you model the grid?
So the grid is really abstractly modeled. We have only used this on a balance of energies. So with this here, with these two equations where we say that the energy demand of a consumer is the sum of all energy flows from the local prosumer to this consumer, and the energy which is flows from the global grid to this consumer. And the same is here for the prosumers, where we say the production of a prosumer is the sum of all local energy flows from this prosumer to all consumers, and the energy which is provided which is sold to the global grid. So our test bed is really local, so we have that are all directly connected consumers and prosumers.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other question? I have a second question, if I can, Markus.
Yes.
Do you know how much the time of computing is growing with the growth of the number of producers and consumers and prosumers? I mean, is the model able to manage a large number of operators?
Okay, the problem, as this model formulation is really nice because there's only no integer variables in this problem, so it can be solved by the simplex algorithm, which is well understood, but can also lead to problems because it's NP complex. So it's in this fact, these problems are solved in a few minutes, but we have done some further research, and there we have computation problems with 4 hours for one simplex iteration. As it can be really hard, but with these equations, which are not connected in time. So this can be solved for every time step separately. There's not so much problem with solving it.
Thank you very much.
May I also ask another question?
Okay.
Okay. So the prices are here given exogenously, right?
Yes.
So I wonder whether you could actually try to endogenize at least one or two, at least one of these, for example, the price on the grid, and see how the locals, the prosumers can affect, or whether they can affect the price.
Okay, as the prices are calculated before the simulation.
Because my idea is that if you have a lot of prosumers and they provide a lot of electricity to the grid, maybe this is going to have some effect on the price in the market.
Yeah, our idea is there that if there are lots of prosumers in the grid, then they must they must sell energy to the global grid, and then their price is, as their revenue is then lower.
Ah, okay.
So with this system that the local energy is the better, that the local energy market has the better pricing conditions, then when the PV production increases, they must sell their energy to the global grid, and then their revenue starts decreasing. And so this should be a built-in function that there is not too much PV production in a local grid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if there is any other question. If not, I would go to the second speaker. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you.
And the second speaker is Íñigo Dalguayo from Spain. And the paper is related to the future of capacity remuneration mechanism in the EU, revisited. And we don't have yet the first wave of capacity remuneration. We are already talking about the second wave, but this is correct. I think this is very important. Understanding the capacity of the system to invest is really important. And I'm really glad to host this talk, because I think we need to know more about the effect of a capacity remuneration connected to the energy remuneration in the electricity market. So please, Íñigo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my presentation. I hope you can see it now. I feel very happy to be in this ambience of economists, because myself and my colleagues are lawyers. We are lawyers, and we deal with energy law and energy policy, with the exception of Professor Trost from Szczecin University, who is also in the area of economics. But Professor Ferrari from Bocconi and myself, we are both lawyers, and I am very happy to summarize what we have been working in this field in past months to be presented here. I feel also very happy because this is the second time I participate in the Italian meeting, the Italian summit. The first one was in 2018, and I did a presentation about hydrogen and renewable gases, also with Professor Ferrari, and that was also very pleasant. And fortunately, that one was physical, so, and was in Milano. So we were very happy to meet, and I addressed this presentation today in the hope that next one can be physical, which is this is good to be here with the technology, but nothing to do with real meeting in a physical room. Okay. What is the aim of the capacity remuneration mechanisms, the CRM? In this is acronym. The final aim is to guarantee security of supply. That is, one should not forget this. We must always have this in mind, bear this in mind. However, the big problem of capacity remuneration mechanisms is that they distort markets because they provide with an advantage to those producers which are getting capacity remuneration mechanisms against those who don't. So if security is the aim, the limit must be economic efficiency. The limit for CRMs should be the limit of those CRMs, and of course the amount of mechanisms the market should allow. We now are moving towards a new paradigm, which is not based in security and neither in efficiency, economic efficiency, but in the third pillar of any energy system. And the third pillar is environmental sustainability. And in the future 50 years, we shall be constructing, setting up a paradigm which is based in sustainability and not so much in efficiency and security. This is when you work, when you design policies, energy policies, you always have these three elements, and sometimes you put the emphasis in one of them, sometimes you put the emphasis in some other one. I think in past 30, 40 years, the emphasis was in efficiency, whereas in the 20th century, or the most part, the biggest part of the 20th century, it was security, then efficiency, and now is sustainability. And in a market based in solar and wind, which is the future, solar, wind, solar energy and wind energy, then you need some capacity remuneration mechanisms in favor of those units which shall provide the security which solar and wind don't have. And this, in my view, this will be the main role of CRM in the future. When market liberalization started in the United Kingdom and in the USA with Thatcher, Reagan, now almost 40 years ago, fundamentalists of markets said that market will always provide the signals on when and how much to invest. But that has not always been the case, and progress has shown that there is the need of kind of planning, because market does not always give the sufficient signals to invest in new infrastructure or new production. And now we are in a moment in which in the European Union we clearly distinguish between the segment of regulated activities, networks, and the segment of liberalized activities, production and supply. And this make a strong difference on how you design CRMs. The missing money problem. CRMs try to solve the missing money problem. When the price of electricity in the energy market does not provide sufficient remuneration to cover the fixed costs of capacity, that is the missing money problem. And if it happens, investors lack incentives to build new capacity and may want to close capacity. CRMs become a real option when governments fix or regulators fix maximum prices, because this is the beginning of the money to miss. This is the beginning of the problem of the missing money. If the price doesn't reflect the scarcity situation, the incentive to build a new plants appears, and the remuneration for market prices in the short term is insufficient to recover the investment in all the plants needed to satisfy the demand efficiently. So in this slide, we have summarized the question. Do we need additional remuneration for conventional power plants? In addition to the income from the energy market? This is the debate. In theory, the only energy market should be sufficient. However, the wholesale price may be unable to provide the necessary signal. It may become necessary regulatory mechanisms that either helps to invest in new generation capacity or rewards those other resources. In the European Union, there was this debate for several years. The results of the debate were published in a long book edited by Professor Lee Hancher from the Netherlands with other colleagues. And the conclusions of those debates reflected in that book have now been transposed into the regulation 2019 number 943 about the internal market for electricity, which lays down the EU rules for capacity remuneration mechanisms. And because I see, Mr. Chair, that I have already consumed almost 15 minutes. No?
No, it's okay. You have
Okay.
spoken only 9 minutes.
Oh,
So
perfect.
you
Perfect.
have more time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Which role capacity remuneration mechanism should play in the European Union? We read in the first lines of the regulation, this regulation 2019-943, we read that CRMs are taken by member states to ensure that electricity supply can match demand in the medium and long term. They are designed to support investment to fill the expected capacity gap and ensure security of supply. CRM offer additional rewards to capacity providers on top of income obtained by selling electricity on the market in return for maintaining existing capacity or investing capacity needed to guarantee security of electricity supplies. CRMs have a strong impact on competition, and this is why CRMs for the European Commission and for the European institutions are a kind of state aid. And as you well know, state aids are incompatible with the internal market according to the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. It's a way of governments helping local or national production in several areas. This will be in the area of electricity production to compete in beneficial situation against competitors. So in principle, CRM are a state aid, but they can be approved, they can be allowed if member states show the need to introduce a kind of CRM to allow investment to take place. In general terms, the CRM are designed, as we read in this slide, to help investment or to foster investment in the short and in the medium and long term. But you also have in several member states other kind of CRM, which is to guarantee the covering of the demand at any time in the short term, when there is a shortage or there is an unexpected disruption. You need to have mechanisms by which the demand is satisfied even against that disruption or Chapter 4 of the 2019 regulation, the number 943 regulation, is devoted to resource adequacy. That is how the regulation, the new regulation, refers to the CRMs. CRMs, we read also in the regulation, must be based on a methodology of evaluation of resource adequacy through shared resources. European resource adequacy, prepared by ENSO-E. This means that in these days of taking into account the level of integration of the electricity market, CRMs by a member state must be designed in view of the security of the entire European Union. It's no longer a problem, only a national problem, but this mechanism must take into account how neighbor countries or the entire EU may help to solve your own adequacy problems. They should cause the least possible disruption in the internal market. And this sentence shows one of the main characteristics which CRMs must have in the future, and that is exceptionality. CRMs can be allowed as an exception, and as a policy makers and even as lawyers, it's very important to realize that a CRM is an exception, which can be allowed. In other words, the fact that the regulation contains a chapter on resource adequacy doesn't mean that the EU thinks that you can have CRMs as a rule. No, CRMs can be allowed as an exception. It designed under clear and transparent criteria to minimize the distortion in cross-border trade, to promote the use of demand response, to reduce any effects that harm decarbonization, avoiding isolated national mechanisms in terms of capacity that would create new barriers in the market and undermine competition. The new Chapter 4 of Regulation 2009 specifies what condition CRMs can have, and it establishes how regional operational centers, national TSOs, ENSO-E, and national regulators through ACER will participate in the development of technical parameters. We have in our presentation identified the summary of those conditions. They are listed in Article 22. Any capacity mechanism shall be temporary, not create undue market distortion, and not limit cross-zonal trade, not go beyond what is necessary to address the adequacy concern, select capacity providers by means of transparent, non-discriminatory and competitive process, provide incentives for capacity providers to be available in times of expected system stress, ensure that remuneration is determined through the competitive process, and in practical terms, this pushes to auctions. This pushes into the fact that those who are getting an additional remuneration should be selected by means of competitive auctions, and giving the chance to everybody, to any agent of the market, not only incumbents and not only big producers or vertical integrated companies, but also all kind of storage, aggregators, communities, etc. G, set out the technical conditions for the participation of capacity providers in advance. Be open to participation of all resources. Apply appropriate penalties to capacity providers that are not actually available when they are needed. And there are specific requirements when the capacity mechanism has been designed, and strategic reserve. A strategic reserve, at least from a Spanish perspective, is big hydroelectricity, is a strategic reserve. And in any case, the CRMs never can mean that there is more pollution, but on the contrary, less pollution. And this is the last slide, Mr. Chair. We address in our presentation a comparison between the situation in Italy, in Poland, and in Spain. In both Italy and Poland, the situation is close to the new criteria of the 2019 regulation by means of 2 European Commission decisions allowing the CRMs in both Italy and Poland. Both in the case of Italy, that decision is the result of several years of discussion between the Italian government and the European Commission. And in the case of Poland, it's also a long discussion, mainly taking into account the polluting situation of the units in Poland. In Spain, the government suppressed CRMs in 2018, at the end in December 2018, 2 years from now. And in September this year, the government issue a consultative process among everybody to asking incumbents their opinion about if CRM should be reintroduced and how. Thank you very much for allowing me to give this presentation, and I hope it has been of interest, and of course I am at your disposal if you have any questions.
Thank you, Inigo. For sure it is interesting because it's quite important topic, and from economic point of view, there is always the problem of the double remuneration of the fixed costs of the power plant when we introduce a CRM. So the exceptionality you are talking about is important. But I don't know if there is anybody which has any question for Inigo. Please take the floor.
So I have one actually. This is not particularly related to the European Union, but the UK mechanism was recently went through this law process where one of these demand response operators were claiming that they were treated not they were treated differently than the other generators. But then in the end, it was said that no, it's not the case, and then the mechanism has been restarted again. I was wondering your opinion on this matter, actually, because it's kind of still not so clear for me.
Okay. Thank you for your question. Can you please repeat which kind of producers in the United Kingdom were being benefited against others?
So the claim was that one of these demand management operators,
okay.
I don't remember its name, but he was claiming that it was facing different conditions, and from competitive grounds, it was against competitive forces, etc. So there was this slow process, and in the end, there was no evidence for such a thing. But that was a bit surprising for me, I would say.
Okay. For example, the demand response will be, for example, local closed distribution networks, which for small closed distribution networks who claim that they were not being awarded any CRM against, for example, big nuclears or.
Yes, I think their claim were mainly about the duration of the contracts, which were significantly lower than the duration, for example, for baseload operators. So, yeah.
Well, in that regard, I think that this will be the scope for the introduction of some kind of positive discrimination when designing auctions. All kind of auctions for to award new renewable capacity. We are now establishing a new system of auctions in Spain for new renewable capacity, but the law, a very recent law, says that a certain amount of megawatt should be reserved to new energy communities. So we could do the comparison and saying, well, when you make an auction to award capacity remuneration mechanisms, you should reserve some payments, some remuneration to small agents. Not so. That would be, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, if there is not any more questions, I think we can stay on the same topic, because the next presentation is again on the electricity market capacity remuneration, and it is given by Tunç Durmaz from Turkey. And he's talking about the strategic capacity withholding in Turkey.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arturo. I have been having a lot of fun since the start of the session. I'm also familiar with the modeling from the prosumers perspective. So in that sense, it was a very interesting talk by Marcus, and also Inigo. You also presented a very clear picture, which I'm very happy about. Because if you look at the remuneration mechanism in Turkey, it is really different, and it's like very primitive when you compare it. So that's why we thought that maybe it's good to take a look at it. But I learned a lot. So today's topic is related to two issues. One is exactly about the remuneration mechanism, and the other one is about generation failures and whether these failures are made on actually purpose, which is one way to say it, of abusing market power and issues related to that. So this is a joint paper prepared by me. So I'm Tunç Durmaz and Sevil Acaraytekin and Simay Kızılkaya. So it's an ongoing work. So there is still some things to do, but I think it's pretty much needs to put in more details rather than to generate new results. So what we do is we use the facility outage data and maintenance in particular power plant failures, the announced power plant failures and their durations. That can be found in the transparency platform at the Energy Exchange Istanbul, abbreviated as EXIST or EPIAŞ in Turkish. And what we ask is whether we can detect a strategic withholding with strategic capacity withholding, which is a market manipulation practice through market failures. So the idea here is that a power generator can announce failure, but maybe it's a mechanical failure, for example, but in reality, maybe it's just a shutdown of the power plant. So that's not so obvious from the start. And the second question we ask is whether this capacity remuneration mechanism affect these failures actually. But I'm going to explain in more detail with what I mean by the two. So the first motivation we have had was electricity markets hardly provide sufficient resources for new generation capacity investments. So Inigo explained this very well. And the principal reason is that these markets are highly regulated for reasons that electricity plays a significant part in our daily lives. So it's like a necessity, and the affordable electricity price is important. But these price suppressing actions, such as price caps, is leading to this missing money problem. Because of the political, social, and economic consequences that power shortages can lead to, inadequate investments will not be tolerated. So there should be something done for this missing money problem. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge chaos. Therefore, these remuneration mechanisms have been introduced to ensure adequate generation capacity. Now, I don't need to talk too much about it a lot because Inigo explained everything very nicely. But let's see. Let me explain a little bit more on strategic withholding. So the regulation of electricity markets worldwide led to another concern. So in addition to missing money, there's another concern because operators can strategically withhold some generating capacity to increase electricity prices. So to purposefully increase the prices. And this strategy relies on the convex supply schedule in the market, which is coming from the merit order, and the inelastic short-run demand. So if, for example, we are in the part of the supply curve when convexity really dominates, a little bit of capacity withdrawal can significantly increase the prices. So, and this may be the reason why some power plants announce failures, but in reality, maybe it's just a way of trying to manipulate the price. So this is what we are after. And okay, so the other part of our research is that we focus on the renovation mechanism because failures not only comes from strategic reasons, but it may also come from bad management and X inefficiencies, etc. So, and our capacity mechanism in Turkey may be contributing to this. So how is that possible? First of all, this mechanism has been entered into force in 2018. It aims to establish a sufficient installed power capacity to assure long-run security of supply, which is what we already learned. And coal-fired power plant, natural gas power plant, and the hydropower plants can benefit from the mechanism. No renewables and no other operators such as demand management or firms, etc. Payments made to the eligible operators are calculated using a formula based on parameters which are entirely specified by the Energy Market Regulatory Authority, EMRA in short. So payments are not decided in the market. They are decided by a central authority. Capacity markets have demonstrated that they can efficiently and effectively meet their objectives and performance expectations as long as they're carefully designed and administered. But with its parameters determined solely by EMRA, it's not so clear to us that this mechanism in Turkey can achieve its aim of a sufficient power capacity to ensure long-term supply. And And now I'm trying to, I will explain why that may be the case. So when we think about regulation in the electricity markets and the mechanisms in that regard, there are two polar cases. So one is the price cap, and the other one is this cost of service approach. So due to these various imperfections in the energy on the market design, price caps has been implemented, and Turkey is also implementing it. And but on the other hand, there is also this cost of service approach to, you know, to make sure that the power plants can cover their costs, in particular the fixed costs. So the firm here is compensated for its total cost of production. And what we have witnessed in the Turkish market is that price caps has never been binding for quite some time. So there is a price cap of 2,000 Turkish lira per megawatt hour, but it has been never reached so far, in particular during the period that we are interested with. So it has never been effective. So for this reason, we kind of try to focus on the cost of service approach, because the capacity mechanism has this flavor to it, because it's kind of funding the power plants to cover their fixed costs. So that's one way to aid these power plants. But this cost of service mechanism approach has been investigated a lot in the literature, and this mechanism can lead to moral hazard problems such as managerial slackness, inefficiencies, and the costs associated with it. So therefore, not only we asked whether there is strategic capacity withholding through failures, but also we asked whether capacity payments are actually contributing to this managerial slackness, and in that sense, clears the failures, the duration of the failures in the electricity market. So regarding the literature, I will be a little bit quick here, but there are not a lot of papers which study strategic withholding. There are only two papers. One has been published recently. It was, let me see, it was by Vogelberg and Lazarchik. It's published in Energy Journal, and the other one is Bergler and his friends, which was published in Energy Policy in 2017. So I'm going to explain what we do differently compared to them. We use actually hourly data in our analysis, where on the other hand, these two other papers are using daily data. Instead of the number of failures that they use, we use actually not only the number, but the duration of the failures, or of each failure that has been announced in this transparency platform. And we also calculate not only the duration of the failures, but the affected capacity during this duration. So how much capacity is being lost for that type of the duration. And also we include this remuneration mechanism and the power plants which were inside the mechanism, and we include also them to the analysis to see whether by being in the mechanism has any impact on the duration of the failures. So the data starts from 2018 September, and that's mainly because the Exist started its wholesale activities in the electricity market as of the same date. The data on capacity payments are retrieved from the Turkish Electricity Transmission Company, and the rest of the data is obtained from this Exist transparency platform. So the main variables that we use in our analysis is F, standing for the duration of failures in minutes. But in particular, we don't only focus on failures, but so we discriminate against failures. So we particularly focus on the failures which were reported after the incident took place, because sometimes the failures are, so these generators inform the failures way before then the failure happens. So then we know that there is not much of a strategic motivation behind this failure. But when the message comes, when the failure happens and the message of the failure comes afterwards, then you can get suspicious about it. Maybe that's because you know, something is happening in the background. And we excluded failures which actually lasted for more than 1 day, because if it lasts too long, then it has got nothing to do with strategic motivation. And also F cap stands for affected capacity from the failure times the duration of the failure, because these power plants announce the amount of affected capacity when the failure began. So we also calculate the duration times the affected capacity, which kind of gives us a variable in terms of megawatt hours. So we also use market clearing electricity prices. So we use the share of wind in the total energy supply. Wind is the dominant renewable energy source in Turkey, but we also look at the total share of renewable energy in the total energy supply. Then we have we use the load forecast plan (LD), and we have the dummy variable, which equals 1 if the generator receives funding from the remuneration mechanism. So these are the summary statistics, but let me just jump into the regressions or the empirical strategy first. So first of all, prices can directly affect how generators are operated. So I mean, mainly there's an endogeneity problem here. So ordinarily square regression would give biased estimates. You know, prices. Okay, so to estimate the causal effect of prices on generation failures, we use a linear two-step model, an instrument for prices using natural gas price. So we choose natural gas price because Turkey is a major importer of natural gas. So it takes the price of global, let's say, or regional price of natural gas given. And in light of the significant share of these natural gas power plants in the energy mix, natural gas power plants are the price setting units in the market in light of the merit order as well. So due to the simultaneity between failures and the price, so you know, failures can lead to higher prices, and also prices can also affect whether there's a failure or not due to strategic reasons. There is a simultaneity problem. So we apply the instrumental variable technique and instrument for day-ahead prices through the following equation, which, as I said, includes natural gas price. And in the second stage, we apply the, no, I didn't run this, but we apply the two-stage least squares, limited information maximum likelihood, and the generalized method of moments estimation approaches using the structural equation that you see. So we have failures on the left-hand side, the logarithm of the price, the ratio of the wind in the total energy supply, the logarithm of the demand, and the dummy variable standing for the capacity remuneration mechanism. And the results are interesting. Actually, we kind of find evidence for strategic withholding. For example, when there is when you look here, when there is a 1% increase in the price, we see that the duration of failures in the market increases by 0.6%. So this is an evidence, this can be argued as an evidence for the strategic withholding, capacity withholding in the market. And on the other hand, if there is an increase in the, let's say, share of wind energy in the energy mix, so we see, for example, a 1 point increase is going to lead to a 1.5 increase in the duration of failures. And if I look at the demand, actually demand has a negative relationship between failures. So a 1% increase in demand leads to nearly 3% reduction in the number of failures. And interestingly, the duration of failures that comes from the power plants in the mechanism is actually 150 minutes more. So that kind of is an evidence which shows that the power plants in the mechanism are causing more and more failures, which may actually hint that there's a moral hazard problem here. So we do a similar analysis with the duration of the affected capacity. So how much capacity is being lost because of these failures? And what we see here is also similar to what I've shown you earlier. So a 1% increase in price leads to a 5% loss in affected capacity, or 5% loss in capacity in the electricity market, which sounds a little bit scary, I would say. And also one unique. Okay, let's look at also the capacity mechanism. So we see that in the capacity mechanism, on average, there is 864 megawatt hour of capacity is affected within the mechanism. So that also hints for this moral hazard problem, which I talked about. Okay, so of course there is a test for the relevance and the strength of the instruments to see if our instruments is doing its job well, and we also check for the endogeneity, and we see that our instrument is relevant and is strong, as can be seen from this F statistics. So, and also we have not found any endogeneity problem here. Okay, so to conclude, our results suggest that there is strategic withholding through failures, which is one form of market manipulation in the electricity market in Turkey. And the current setup of the capacity mechanism adds to the duration of the failures in the market. So strategic capacity withholding suggests that a verification mechanism may be required to verify these failures. So maybe there should be a two-stage verification. The first one is, okay, there's a failure, and the second one is whether that failure is really a failure. So maybe there should be this verification mechanism there. And the positive effect of the capacity mechanism on capacity payments on the number of failures suggests that the mechanism may need to be redesigned. I mean, that's, well, it needs to be redesigned given that all the parameters are decided by the central authority, that's for sure. But the results actually support this argument, so basically. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I hope this was interesting.
Yes, thank you very much. For sure it is interesting. And I would say it is something we have already seen in other countries. I have a question. What is the level of concentration of the electricity generators in Turkey? I mean, this game works when you have a quite high quota of the electricity generation. How is the generation in Turkey?
You mean the generation mix, or?
No, the ownership of the power plants. I mean, how
okay.
many producers you have with which quota?
Yes, I don't remember exactly the numbers, but since 2010, there has been a significant privatization of these power plants, in particular the coal-fired and gas-fired power plants. So as far as, I may be wrong with my numbers, but I think around 60% is now privately owned, around 60. But I should go back and check these numbers.
Okay, doesn't matter. It's okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other question for Toons?
Okay, I don't
hear anybody.
Now, here, can I make a question?
Please. Sure, please.
So congratulations for your presentation. I think that the effort you have put in finding data has led you to a very nice conclusions. And would you think that, or just to check whether I have understood properly what you said, the first conclusion would mean that in those cases, producers are doing windfall profits because of a bad regulation of the CRMs, no? They are getting extra money,
yes,
to which they shouldn't be allowed. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. They are getting money, but at the same time, they are announcing higher duration of failures. So
okay.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can move to the last talk of this session, and it's Maria Chiara Del Rico from the University of Perugia, and she is talking about electricity demand and mobility and the nexus with COVID-19 and with a heavy lockdown. It is quite interesting right now because I think we never experienced a reduction in electricity demand like the one we had this year. So we are glad to hear your data. Please, Maria Chiara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank everybody to be there and listen this last presentation. This work should have been presented by Professor Boldino, that unfortunately could not be here. So I'm going to show you the preliminary findings, result of this analysis we done with Professor Simona Bigerna and Paolo Polinoris from University of Perugia. This work is an econometric exploration that we have done among three variables. Of course, the change in electricity demand between the level in 2019 and the level now recorded in 2020. The change in mobility caused by the lockdown measures, then data, this change variation in mobility in the Italian mobility was proxied by data that comes from the Google mobility reports. And then we want to try to find some connection with the dynamics of some health variables, then want to express the dynamic of the COVID contagion, the spread and the speed of the contagion. Therefore, what we are going to check, to investigate if mobility, the change in mobility has affected electricity demand. Next, if the mobility, the lockdown measure, the variation in mobility has been able to slow down the COVID contagion. And then this is a particular question that is focused on the Italian case, because in Italy, the first the first wave of COVID contagion particularly referred the north of the north of Italy, and therefore we are going to ask if the zonal heterogeneity is statistically significant, as the zonal heterogeneity in the spread of COVID should be taken into account when some lockdown or government measures are applied in order to decrease, smooth the curve of contagion and as well the intensive care. Therefore, in the next slides, I'm going to show you the dynamic of the recorded in the 2020 for this variable. First, this is we depict the dynamic of the daily average change in electricity demand between 2020 and 2019. And as you see, the average change was essentially equal to 0 before the 10th of March, that is the day when the lockdown began, and then start to dramatically decrease until the 40%. And we depict not only the national level of the average change in the electricity demand, but also the volume trade recorded at regional level. Here, the regions are the physical zone in which Italian electricity market is split according to the grid transmission constraints. And you see that the north, the red line, has recorded the most dramatic decrease in the electricity demand. But of course, this region in Italy is the zone, the physical zone with where are concentrated most of the heavy and industrial activities. And we should, in the next analysis, we would like to adjust this data take into account the moving holidays that cause here in this graph, you see this peak, this change, because here is the Sunday for the Easter. And here, for example, this peak is due to the 1st of May, and then from the 2nd June, all that are days in which in Italy there is a holidays day. And now this is the first graph for the first variable we are going to analyze. Next, we depict the raw data concerning the mobility variation, the change in mobility from workplace, having as a baseline period the period that goes from the 4th of January until the 6th of February 2020. And you see again, when the lockdown started, the mobility dramatically fell. Here there is not so a lot of much heterogeneity among regions, and then after the lockdown the mobility start to recover. These peaks represent, because we are going just to represent the raw data, this peak represent the Sunday, where of course the work mobility is much closer to the normal situation. Then another variable that want to represent the dynamic of mobility concerns the residential mobility. Here, instead, the variable increased. People during the lockdown stay at home 30% more than the normal. And the last two slides want to show you the two health variables we take into account in the analysis. The number of new positive cases. Hey, we can see a lot of heterogeneity among a region. In the middle, you find the number of new positive cases per thousand of population at the national level. But you see the north, the region that was the most hit region, the line, the red line is the highest curve, and you see even in the next slide, what's one that represents the number of intensive care per population per thousand of inhabitants. The cumulative intensive care is the highest compared to the national average, and the rest of Italy compared to the north started recorded the new intensive care start to increase the number of new intensive care with some delayed compared to the north that was before the 10th of March. And we try to focus attention in this on this variable, because we see that the lockdown measure applied by government were essentially essentially aim to smooth, to delay the cumulative curve of the intensive care. And therefore, we would like to know, we would like to check if the lockdown measure that affect the mobility variables has been also effective in slow down the spread of contagion and the number of people hospitalized in intensive care. But this kind of, therefore, we want to try to understand, to investigate if there is some relationship among these three kind of variables, and which is where is the direction of the relationship. For COVID, we mean the two health variable depicted before, that is the new intensive cares and the number of new positive cases. Energy is the percentage change in electricity demand between the 2 years, and mobility is can be the mobility at work or the residential mobility. We want to investigate this kind of relationship using the Granger causality test. That is, we we are going to test if the lag of some regressor that can be the health variable or the demand or the electricity demand or the mobility variables, the lag of this regressor are significant, affect the dynamic of another variables. That can be one of the three variables before show you. And of course, all of these things has a theoretical background, that is the electricity demand is a function of economic and household activity that can well proxied by the mobility at work and residential mobility. And therefore, the change in this electricity demand can be expressed, we want to investigate if this change in the electricity demand is a function of the lockdown measure, was affected by the lockdown measures. And then we want to investigate also if the health variable expressed by the number of intensive care and the number of new positive cases has been affected by the lockdown measure. That is mobility. Granger caused the number of new positive cases and the number of new intensive care. And therefore, at national level, these were the result and the statistic test for the Granger causality test at national level. And we have to focus just, first of all, in the first line, where mobility affect the Granger cause, we can say, the change in electricity demand in the overall period. And then we divided also this, and also in the other sub-period with which we divided the study period. And this sub-period corresponds to the date in which government announced a new decree, a new technical decree. But even focus on this, instead of focusing on this table, maybe it's better to show you the graphical relationship we recover from the Granger causality test. We see that the health variable new positive is exogenous with respect to the change in electricity demand. While we see that mobility Granger cause, the test say that reject the null hypothesis of non-Granger causality, the mobility Granger cause the number of new positive cases. And we found a univocal relationship between the work mobility and the energy. For what concern, if we just change the workplace in the test with the residential mobility, we found the same direction of the relationship. That is, residential mobility, Granger cause, the residential mobility that want to proxy the residential activity, the Granger cause, the change in electricity demand, and residential mobility affect, we can say that negatively affect the number of new positive. And therefore, in this case, we can say, okay, lockdown was effective in slow down the contagion or the number of new positive cases. But when we look at the national level at the other health variable, the number of intensive care, we see that there was we didn't find any kind of Granger causality between mobility workplace and intensive cares. That is, the lag of mobility does not affect the dynamic of intensive care. Here we can say, okay, lockdown, the lockdown measure applied by government that block all the economic activity were effective to reduce, to smooth the cumulative of the number of the cumulative curve of the number of intensive care. And the same results are found if we swap workplace mobility with the residential mobility. And this then Bollino start to estimate vector autoregressive model among these three variables, and the forecaster of variable decomposition essentially confirm the finding of the Granger causality test, because if you see the variable, the electricity demand change variable has a variance that is explained by the 50% of mobility and by the 2% of intensive care. If we look, for example, on shock on the shock that comes from mobility. The shock from mobility affect both electricity and mobility, but has no effect on intensive care. And if you look at the last row of the variance decomposition referring to the intensive care, we see that the variance of intensive care is explained by 98% by itself. That means that intensive care only responds only on its own shocks, we can say. Therefore, there is no any kind of Granger causality, even in this with the forecaster variant decomposition between intensive care and mobility. This analysis was performed at national level. Now but then we would ask, okay, the contagion was different among regions, and this heterogeneity among regions should be taken into account when some kind of lockdown measures are applied to the national at national level. Therefore, what we do, it was to apply the same Granger causality test using a panel data structure, where here the panels, the cross-section are the physical zone in which the electricity market is split. Here we use the same kind of variable used in the national analysis. Zonal electricity demand, because as you see before in the graph, we depict even the zonal electricity change, zonal change in the electricity demand. Then the number of intensive care per population, new positive cases aggregated at zonal level as well. We are aggregated at zonal level the average mobility recorded in each region. And first, in this panel analysis, we apply before even the, we check for the stationarity of the time series, and we apply to test that is useful and well fit with panel data. The first in 11-in-2 test, where want to test the null hypothesis that all panels are not stationary, they contain a routine root, against the alternative hypothesis that panels are all stationary. The second test we apply is the Pesar and Shear, where the null hypothesis is the same. All panels are not stationary, they contain a unit root, but the alternative hypothesis is that some panels can be stationary. That is, this second test allowed to the autoregressive parameter of time series to vary among panels, allow the autoregressive parameter to be different among panels. And for this test, we
excuse me, Maria Chiara, 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. Then,
yes, 2 minutes. If you can conclude, please.
Sì, yes.
Sorry.
As I said before, we applied the same Granger causality test specific for panel structure, and what we found is that we found the same bionivocal relationship with mobility and energy, but we find only a relation significant for the north region between mobility and new positive, as well for the residential. But this was conducted at national level. The main problem was with intensive care. The mobility has affected intensive care at panel level. We see that here is the result at national level. Then we found instead a significant relation, Granger causality, between mobility and the number of intensive care. Therefore, we can say that lockdown measures were effective only if we think at the north part of the Italy. And same things for the residential mobility. This is the result at national level, but if we think at the Granger causality test for panels data, we see another Granger causality relationship between mobility and intensive care. Here, the result of the p-value of the Granger causality test conducted at panel level, and this is just the analysis performed for the period next to the lockdown. But I think now we can move on with the result and go directly to the conclusion. We found a significant relationship between the change in electricity that this was affected by mobility by the lockdown measure, as well we found a significant relationship between the change in electricity demand and the increasing number of intensive care. Probably this is a technological effect. For what concerns the mobility, the link between mobility and the health variable, there was a positive relationship significantly between new positive cases and mobility. But if we look at intensive care, the relationship was significant only if we look at the north of Italy. And therefore, what we have the conclusion, the open question that Bollino wrote is that one size fits measure is effective in slow down what was effective in slow down the contagion. If you see at the second wave of COVID, the government try now to differentiate between the heterogeneity among the regions, split Italy between red, yellow, and orange zone. Sorry, I was a bit late, and thank you for your attention. If you have any question, I'm really pleased to answer.
Thank you, Maria Chiara, for the presentation and for showing the nexus between energy demand and the pandemic. Any question from the floor? No, I don't hear any voice. So I think we can conclude with some minutes of delay, but I hope this is not so heavy for the organization. Thank you to all of you for joining this session and for your presentations. And for sure, we didn't use a lot of energy for our session compared to a traditional conference, because no one of us moved from his hometown. And so I would leave the floor to the organization. Is anybody from AIEE who can take the control of the system? I don't know. If there is not, okay. Otherwise, I thank all of you, and I wish you a very good conference with the other sessions.
Thanks a lot, Arturo.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Nice meeting
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Best wishes.